Last week, the Adam Smith Institute published a 16-page paper about reforming taxi and private hire for the 21st century. But what does this mean? Is this the end for taxis in London? Well, stay tuned to find out. Now, a fair shake, reforming taxis for the 21st century has been picked up by lots of popular media outlets, including Piers Morgan's show Uncensored. But what does this actually mean for drivers like me? Firstly, let's understand this document and why it was made. It was made by the Adam Smith Institute, which is a free market think tank, i.e. they make documents or publications kind of designed to bring out new information or show information in a slightly different way. Now, of course, the Adam Smith Institute is not a charity. There, of course, would be some sort of funding to go into this. So the burgeoning question I would ask you when reading this or looking at any journalistic entity that cites this paper is, who is paying for this paper? Now, I don't have any definitive evidence that this paper has been funded by any of the large ride-sharing apps, but as most of the points proposed in here seem to make ride-sharing private hire access a lot easier and reforming taxis by getting rid of them entirely, I'll let you draw upon your own conclusions. I wanted to read the paper myself. I didn't want to just get swept up in what the media outlets were saying. I wanted to look at this paper and specifically the references within it. I'm going to start with a title. It's called A Fair Shake, and the subtitle is Reforming Taxis for the 21st Century. Now, one of the points that's proposed by this paper is to align taxis and private hire vehicles, or sometimes ride-sharing vehicles, into one single tier designation. So there's no distinction between a taxi and a private hire. It will all get lumped into one thing. But I'm a bit upset that the actual title is Reforming Taxis, not Reforming Taxis and Private Hire. Therefore, it just feels like it's a complete stab at the taxi drivers specifically, including the fact that they've got this photo of 3 cabs lined up coming out the Beach Street Tunnel. I don't have to go very far into this paper to find some problems that I want to highlight. On page 3, there's a wonderful quote by an MP in 1963, and it's basically suggesting the idea that taxi cabs or taxis in London are a little bit antiquated because they have to be a particular kind of vehicle and that they have to go through the knowledge. And at first glance, this quote seems apt because it's like, okay, well, there was a problem in the 1960s and, you know, we're still writing papers about it on this day. So clearly there's some sort of trend throughout history. The issue is this quote was from 1963, and at this time, taxis in London actually had a monopoly. In 1961, there was the very first form of minicabs. It was a company called Welbeck Motors, founded by Michael Gottler, who was actually a law graduate himself, and kind of saw a gap in the market that taxis could have been antiquated. There needed to be some sort of alternative service. So he brought in this saloon-style cars, and just 1 year later, these were outlawed because of the fact that they were trying to imitate taxis in many ways. But this was the kind of start of the private hire evolution in London, and it took some decades later, even right up until the late 90s, before there was an actual bill passed regulating private hire vehicles within the capital. So Rupert Spear, the MP who said this quote, was quite right, I would agree. But that's not the same situation nowadays. There is an abundance of private hire and or ride-sharing options. So we can disregard this quote entirely. Now, as the author of this paper is a politics and history joint honours graduate with a first-class degree, I would have thought they might have looked a little bit deeper into the source of this quote and the context at that time. History, after all. Now, the author opens with quite a reasonable introduction, I would say, in that cost of living crisis that we're going through now, inflation, restrictions in the capital as to what kind of vehicles you can buy. People aren't necessarily having private vehicles, so there is more of a demand for private hire, ride sharing, and even taxi services because it's much easier to jump into one of these vehicles rather than trying to jump through all the logistics of owning your own vehicle in London. Now, I believe the overall objective of this paper is really to promote ride sharing, say that, oh God, the situation's so awful, we can't get in ride sharing cars. And to make it even worse, the licensing procedure is so long and lengthy. Help us, there's a problem here. We need to get as many ride sharing vehicles as possible. And more annoyingly, it uses taxi examples as a way of kind of saying, well, look how long and antiquated it is to get a taxi license. this needs to be scrapped also. So I think this paper could have been more effective if it just focused on private hire and ride sharing rather than trying to lump itself in with taxis and trying to make this single tier system, as it refers to. Now, one point which the author does bring up, which I do agree with to some extent, is the fact that we have different licensing authorities across the UK, and not one of them necessarily talks to another. So there's 316 in total. So the author suggests kind of more of a centralised system, whereby one, maybe a government department, will run this entire system across the country. And then it's an accessible database that they can have access to. So if there's foul play going on in Liverpool or in London, every operator will have access to that. Now again, looking at it in terms of this paper, why is this a necessity? What's wrong with the current system? Well, the author argues that each licensing authority will have their own complicated set of hoops to jump through, meaning that if you wish to get licensed as a ride-sharing or private hire driver, it's quite a complicated process. It's promoting the idea of being sped through the licensing process. The taxi industry lacks newer drivers, which, as this paper shows, is due to confusing and difficult regulations. I wouldn't argue that. I would say that there's just more opportunities available now. So doing the knowledge, driving a taxi, I feel like it was one of those things that many years ago, your friend of a friend might have done it, and it's like, oh, look at Bob, he did the knowledge and now he's doing all right for himself. And then that kind of spurgeons more people on to do it. Whereas now, because of the internet age, we all know someone who's like an Instagram superstar. We all know someone who's like a YouTube superstar. It just seems like there's so many more avenues and opportunities available for young people, anyone really, any walk of life who want to just pivot on their career. That's probably why taxi numbers are lower, not down to confusing or difficult regulations. The regulation and entry has remained the same. Like, we've had this system of the knowledge since 1865. So we can't actually say that the lack of new entrants is because the system's confusing. It's been the same way for quite a long time. It goes on to add that this has a deleterious effect on travel, with lower supply contributing to longer wait times and in part higher fares. Now this of course references to the fact that private hire or ride-sharing apps have a surge price, whereby if there's a higher demand, the prices go up. And again, coming back to the whole objective of this paper, I believe that it is for companies like Uber, Ola's, Bolts and things like that. They don't want to have to surge price, because if they surge price, the customer is having to pay a higher rate than a taxi for a worse service. They're having to wait longer, the car isn't any better, and they are paying more. So at which point it's better to jump in the taxi. If, however, they can have a high amount of drivers, so they have a higher turnover but a very small margin, then they can compete with black cabs. I'm all for it. Like, if ride sharing can actually sustain itself at the lower prices, which I firmly believe they can't because they've had plenty of time to prove this in London, then go ahead, be my guest. But they're not going to do it. The only way they can achieve this is by onboarding so many more new drivers so they can keep the prices low. It's a bad deal for the drivers because they of course earn less money on their fares because they don't surge so much. Good deal for the passengers, but the only way they can achieve such high numbers of drivers is being able to relax licensing conditions, which is what this paper seeks to achieve. Now, one of the first references I'm going to pull apart here is there's a reference here, and it's regards to how our meter fares are calculated. Now, I've shared this on previous videos before, but the meter in a taxi is actually calculated upon the cost of the vehicle, cost of insurance, tax, running, upkeep, and general cost of living. So it's kind of a bit of a formula that goes on here. The author actually cites a paper, it's quite a famous economic paper, called The Use of Knowledge in Society, published in 1945, but it charts in like the top 50 of like influential economic papers. I'm not an economist, by the way, and nor is the person who wrote this paper. My understanding of that paper is that if you looked at, say, a sheep farmer, and he was the most knowledgeable sheep farmer in all of the land, but his knowledge is not going to be as good compared with 1,000 average sheep farmers, because they've all got kind of aggregated opinions. So if you pull together all of those 1,000 sheep farmers versus that one incredibly smart and influential sheep farmer, then their 1,000 are going to have a much greater pool of knowledge. But he uses the paper in regards to the Uber pricing model. Turning them into a free market model, fares will be able to better spontaneously adapt to these costs rather than waiting for each fare review. So basically saying that because the price fluctuates in an Uber based upon live conditions, that is much better than my taxi meter, because my taxi meter is antiquated. It's based upon one set of data points rather than all these other different data points from riders, users and drivers. Now, if there was a lot of factors that went into the pricing of our meters, then I would get that point. Understandable. But it's a relatively simple equation. There's only one vehicle you can buy brand new in London if you want to do the job. So the task of setting the metered rate is relatively simple, because the vehicle costs the same, the tyres are all the same because it's the same vehicle, the fuel is going to be the same because it's the same efficiency. So the reference, the use of knowledge in society of, oh, let's aggregate all these costs that go into running a vehicle from all these other data points, is pointless. Because we have one vehicle effectively in London. Yes, I know we've got the older TX4s and the Vitos, but they're slowly being phased out. So he's just put it in there because it's quite a famous paper, and it's like makes it look more credible. Oh, if I use this famous paper, then it's going to make my paper look more credible as a result. But it doesn't actually quite hit the mark, in my opinion. I'm livid at this point here in making transport fairer on page 5. What's really annoying is that the author of this paper basically says to become a taxi driver is a bit of a long and antiquated system, and it uses some of the numbers specifically from doing the knowledge as a case in point of, oh, look how expensive it is to become a black cab driver. Let's just scrap taxis altogether and make private hire really, really easy for people to get into so we can boost the numbers of private hires. And even more annoying is that he actually uses my own numbers. Remember my video I made about my taxi badge cost me £10,000? It's in this paper. The cost of a licence for a taxi in London can exceed £10,000 by some estimates, after the knowledge is taken into account. And the source he uses is actually from Perry at Taxi Point, who wrote an article about one of my videos, whereby I said that across my 3 years of studying for the knowledge, my costs totaled £10,000. But I was an exceptional circumstance. I made that video purely to say, look, I am very proud to have spent this amount of money on my badge. And the majority of that was petrol costs, driving about 45 miles or so into London 3 times a week. So this is not representative of every knowledge student in London. If you live in London, you can do the knowledge on a push bike. All of a sudden your costs are around £1,500 because you've only got to pay for the exam fees and the licence fees rather than having to pay for petrol and things like that. Because the trouble is, when you introduce a number like that, people gravitate towards that and go, oh, well, oh, in London it costs £10,000 to get a taxi licence. It's almost like the reason why taxi drivers don't share their income. Because in theory, as a taxi driver, I could go out and earn £100,000 in a year. But to do that, I'd have to work 7 days a week and I'd probably have to do 18-hour days. But if I told you that, you would take this number of £100,000, or if I wrote the number £100,000 down, people would look at that number and then all of a sudden start objectifying it and go, wow, look, £100,000, that's what every taxi driver earns. But it's just a one-off example. And the same with this particular source that's used here, my own video. That was a one-off example specific to me. And not related to the paper entirely, I just want to add another point on that. Because anyone reading this might look at that and go, oh, £10,000, that's a lot of money to become a taxi driver. Now, my degree took me 3 years, and I still have about £20,000 of student debt on that degree. However, to do the knowledge took me around 3 years, and of course my expenses were around £10,000. But once I finished the knowledge, I got a shiny badge, and I went to work the evening that I got that badge. When I finished the university, I came out and was as lost as when I went in. So that's just a little caveat I want to add here, just, to put it into perspective, really, that it's not really that much money when you think about, how much money, especially now with more modern student fees, to go to university. There's a part here I do agree on, which is about how old a vehicle can be. This is very much a problem we've had in London with some of our diesel taxis, whereby because they're diesel, they've actually been phased out. They've had their 15-year age limit cut down to 12, and meaning they're off the road a lot quicker. It's basically saying here, however, older cars should be subject to more regular MOTs depending on the number of miles driven and its size. And just reinforcing the fact that if it's an older vehicle, so long as it's checked and maintained, why can't it stay on the road for longer? And I fully agree with that, because I drove a 2008 TX4 the other day, and it drove pretty much the same as a 2015 TX4. It even looks exactly the same. So long as it's maintained, I don't see why they have to be phased out so quickly. So I agree with that. That's a big thumbs up there. And now we're coming back to, like, you know, how much licenses cost. Whilst obtaining a licence can cost up to £1,153.49. That's not what the previous page said. The previous page said it can exceed £10,000. But of course, that's just the licensing cost itself, but whatever. You can't have one without the other. A lot of the things in this paper suggest, you know, being able to get a licence quicker, you know, cutting the cost of licensure is critical to allowing a fairer and more open people transport market. Nonetheless, public safety should remain a key priority of licensure. So I don't get how you can make it cheaper, how you can speed up the licensing process, but still retain public safety. That's kind of a bit of an oxymoron, if you ask me. It goes on to mention that taxis, wheelchair-accessible private hire vehicles and buses retain the exclusionary right to use bus lanes. Yes, because people hail us from the street. When people get on the bus, they need to get access from the curb. When a hand goes up for someone to get into my taxi, they hail us from the streets. We need to be able to pull into that bus lane so we can pick up passengers. If you're private hire, if you're being requested on the app, then you have adequate time to see the person's information. You can even call them and say, I'll tell you what, let's go around the corner and I can pick you up on a safe side street there. It removes the need for having to go in the bus lane. So that's ridiculous. That's just tosh, if you ask me. And in London, as the majority of vehicles are, I suppose, you know, private hire and taxi, then could you imagine how congested the bus lanes would be? The buses wouldn't be able to get anywhere if that was the case. The author of this paper actually refers to the recent tariff update, the taxi fare consultation that was held in 2022, the most recent meter update you might have seen in one of my videos. However, the author disregards the statistics given in that consultation entirely. What's the point in referencing an objective number regarding people who were consulted or were questioned on what they thought of the taxi tariff and then making up your own opinion? The numbers don't lie. So here's the example. Analysis undertaken by the Finance Committee at TfL in March 2022 demonstrated that while most non-taxi drivers and users thought that these regulations, I think the word should be fares because it's a fare consultation, were too expensive. Basically saying that people who don't drive taxis, users and the general public, believe that taxi fares were too expensive. Most of them believe they were too expensive, according to this author. And then goes on to add that almost no taxi drivers agreed that their fares were too expensive, insinuating the fact that us taxi drivers believe our metered fares are too low, that we need a price increase, that we are greedy and we want more money. So by taking what the author has put at face value, you would say, okay, well, that makes sense. Taxi users believe that fares are too expensive. Taxi drivers believe that fares aren't high enough. But thankfully, the author has actually left a link to the exact consultation that TfL published on this matter. And the numbers are completely different. Here's an example. When we're talking about the minimum fare, so when you start the meter and you start it, of the people that were surveyed, 74% of black cab users believed that the starting fare was either about right, much too low, or a little too low. Meaning that 25% believed it was much too expensive or too expensive. That does not sound like most. 25% does not sound like most. But the examples continue. When polled on Tariff 1, which is effectively daytime tariff, Monday to Friday, 64% believed that the price was either too low, much too low, or about right, leaving 35% who believed that the price was either too expensive or much too expensive. Again, that is not most. Most people, black cab users, believed the price was about right or too low. Tariff 2, specifically for the evening rates, so from 8 till 10. Tariff 2, weekend, 56%. Tariff 3, nighttime rate. Tariff 3 on holiday rates, so when we have bank holiday rates. Tariff 4, which is kind of like when you're going out to the airport, when you're on the motorways, things like that. Now, current licensing requirements in the UK stipulate that any applicant must have a GB driving licence, Europe, or Northern Ireland driving licence. Seems fair. What the author goes on to add is that the UK recognises 15 designated foreign countries whose driving licences are able to drive on the road for personal use, but not when it comes to private hire and taxi licences. What kind of makes sense? You're driving people for a profession. We drive on the left as well. So if you get someone from a country that's only ever driven on the right and they come to a very busy and complicated city like London, that just sounds ridiculous. That is an accident waiting to happen, to use the phrase. And then a further statement goes on to conflict an original point, which is, as the government has admitted, the main prevention of accidents is road experience. Well, there's not going to be an experience in the UK if you've not driven in the UK, so we're preventing accidents by giving it to people who have only driven in the UK. Makes perfectly good sense. Now, this is one bit I'm going to get really upset about, and I could make an entire video about. And it goes on to say, the knowledge, as in the taxi knowledge, does not in fact provide significant additional knowledge above that which may be gained from the constant directional and traffic updates that are fed into navigational systems. Are you serious? This comes back to my old chef analogy, or even, like a doctor. Oh, okay, yeah, a surgeon doesn't need any experience. He can just open up a medical textbook whilst he's operating on somebody. No, if you're driving in a very busy city, having prior knowledge of knowing when I'm going to make my turn, when I'm going to turn my indicator on, when I'm going to be in the correct lane is far superior than what any satellite navigation or Waze is going to give you. And in fact, it's even more relevant than ever because of the new mobile phone law that's come into play, whereby you cannot engage with the mobile phone whilst driving. So how are drivers going to update the Waze and these really, really good satellite navigation systems whilst driving? They can't. So, an even better reason why the knowledge is more relevant than ever, because we're not reliant upon sat-navs. We don't have to touch it and go, oh, which way am I going here? Which left am I going to be taking as it comes up? What's also annoying about it, it's a very strong claim, and the reference that is used to make this claim is not backed up. There is nothing to back this up. I can anecdotally say that the knowledge or having various options when I'm driving in London, a city with endless variables in terms of traffic lights, in terms of people cutting in front of lanes and whatever. It's not a case of, oh, okay, the sat-nav doesn't know what it's doing. The sat-nav definitely does know what it's doing, but the sat-nav can't account for all of the endless variables that exist in London, such as if there's a bin lorry blocking the road, if a police officer shuts the road, or if a light turns red and I know if I take a right, I can skip around the light. Really annoying because the source that's provided showing the transformative technology of GPS apps, but there is no evidence, no data in there to prove that Waze is more efficient or better than a trained driver. There's a couple other misnomers in this report as well. So there's things in here saying that across the UK from July 2022, passenger-facing CCTV will be mandated for taxis, private hire vehicles and ride source operators. I'm on the fence with this. I think it's a good idea, but I feel like the bureaucracy, the red tape. While most of this paper advocates on the fact that getting a license is too expensive, it takes too long, it then introduces things like CCTV. Great for safety, but then this is another hoop or hurdle to jump through, which I think is just a bit of a pat on the back for companies like Uber that have these kind of safety processes built in, or trying to build in these safety processes. Another misnomer is the fact that it kind of bigs up Uber again, saying that, it says here, Uber, for its part, now displays a safety toolkit in-app for passengers. Passengers can access a safety toolkit, so presumably if something's going wrong with their journey, maybe they can report it, something like that. Great idea. That's probably one of the good things about apps, is that if you're in any country in the world, you have some kind of a log of that journey, and presumably someone you can contact to kind of report if something might be going wrong. But in the next paragraph, by removing the right to be hailed from the pavement, licensing authorities are endangering the public. So basically saying that if you're a ride-sharing driver, an Uber driver, and there's someone on the pavement who desperately wants to get home, they should have the right to be able to pick that person up off the pavement. So that completely conflicts the idea of the app providing the safety. It's the reason why taxi drivers have to go through such rigorous licensing checks and procedures is because we are dealing with the general public directly. We're not going through an employer who kind of protects us. We are in place of that. The negative impacts of pollution are of significant concern to transport policymakers. Where air pollution is most prevalent, younger people develop more health problems, especially in lower income areas. It is important to facilitate transport that is beneficial for the health and well-being of our communities. Well, let's not operate so many vehicles. It's a ridiculous amount of vehicles that are on the road. And why? Because ride sharing is just trying to undercut a sustainable form of transport, which is taxis. They can't do it. And the only way they can undercut it is, again, by introducing more and more drivers, increasing the turnover on a very, very small margin. That's the only way they can compete with taxi driving. If you license more vehicles, that means more congestion, more traffic, and more pollution, as larger vehicles, diesel vehicles, will have to sit within that traffic. Uber has announced it is hiring an additional 20,000 drivers across the UK in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, demonstrating a greater demand for their services. But frustrating this through licensure rules and hiring regulations, licensing authorities are simultaneously depriving customers of a cheaper and more rapid service and drivers of meaningful employment. I really don't like this statement because it's basically saying, look, our business model sucks. Because we haven't got enough drivers, we have to put the price up because we can't turn a profit. By the way, Uber has never turned a profit. So it's saying, look, if we get more drivers, if we have a much larger pool of drivers, we can lower the cost. And then, of course, that makes it more attractive for our users. What this paper is suggesting is that particularly ride-sharing apps and Uber, as mentioned here, are trying to force their model upon the government, upon the UK, and asking for them to bend the rules or make their model fit. It's through greed they're motivated to do this. They're giving it the, oh, we don't want to charge higher prices, we want to make it really cheap so people can get in and get around the city. But by putting in more drivers and vehicles, it's going to make congestion worse, so you're going to make journey times longer, so therefore removing the idea that getting around a private vehicle is even a good idea entirely. I mean, there's a lot more in here that I could really probe deeper into, but in summary, if the government was to act upon this, where we have this single tier system, where we no longer have taxis and private hire, and we lump them all into one, when I drive my taxi, people hail me down, and they don't look at me and go, cool, isn't he a bit young? Does he know what he's doing? Does he know where he's going? Is he even a taxi driver? No, by having the word taxi emblazoned on top of the light of my vehicle and driving an iconic and recognisable vehicle, people look at me and say, that's a taxi driver, he's gone through the knowledge, he's done all the hard graft, he knows what he's doing. It is a respected brand. By removing the separation of taxis and private hire drivers is almost akin to saying, you know what, we've got police officers and we've got community support officers. If you don't know the distinction between these two, obviously a police officer, we all know a police officer, but you have a community support officer, which is kind of like a light version of policing. They don't need to go through as much rigorous training as the police, and they can do some of the lighter duties to relieve the duties of the police. It's almost like a similar example with taxis and private hire. Private hire don't have to go through the same kind of rigorous testing that we have to do as taxi drivers. And, you know, through different ways, they can pick up people by going through the app. By removing, like, taxis, that iconic brand that a taxi is, it's a bit like removing the uniform of a police officer. When you see a police officer in the street, you don't want to look at them and go, oh, I don't know, is she a proper police officer? Has he done the correct training? No, you see the uniform and you know that that stands as a signifier of trust. And a taxi is exactly the same. Thanks for watching. I highly recommend checking out some of my other videos on the topic of taxis over here. See you soon. Bye-bye.